Hey, it's the Unique History Channel. Welcome back. Tonight we're going to be doing a reading of the book My Struggle, Vladimir ZHIRINOVSKY, and tonight we'll be reading part 1 called Last Bid for the South. So, as always, let's jump in. It is difficult to write about the recent past. Familiarity blurs it. Hearsay, rumor, and biased beliefs distort perspective. To write an account of the so-called socialist period in Russian history would take years. To understand its achievements, and there were many, as well as its tragic failures that caused so much suffering, would take even longer. Yet, to entirely ignore this period in Russian history with its tremendous relevance not only to the whole country, but the whole world's fate is impossible. Monuments, archives, and books can be destroyed, but not the memory of the events that gave rise to them. Nor can one speak of the future while ignoring an entire century so decisively affected the life of every citizen. Yet there is another way to analyze the character of a specific historical period. It is by examining the lives of the individuals whose destinies were shaped by that epoch. In this book, I will therefore use my own life to illustrate the dialectic and nurturing relationship between the individual and society. I will examine the interplay between my personal life, social conditions that shape my will, view, abilities, and character. I'm using my own life because obviously it's the one I know best. Moreover, being the child of a socialist state, I and my story will seem particular and familiar to the majority of my countrymen. I was born in Alma-Ata on April 25th, 1946, on a rainy Thursday evening, somewhere after 10, during the first spring after World War II. We lived in a two-story building on Dugan-Askafia Street in the city that had once been called Verny, the Russian word for faithful. Alma-Ata had been founded in 1854 by Russian Cossacks, entitling me to regard myself as a native Russian among Russians. The apartment building, which I was born, was occupied solely by Russians in a city predominantly Russian. To this day, Russians constitute 86% of its population. Being the offspring of a Russian woman, Alexandra Pavlovna ZHIRINOVSKY, whose mother, and therefore my grandma, was Fiona Nikiroma Mordakova, I always considered myself a Russian. And in fact, my grandfather, Pavel Ivanovich Marakov, who died of typhus in 1919, was a soldier in the Tsarist army, but whether on the sides of the Reds or the Whites, I do not know. I was born in the very same apartment where I was to spend the first 18 years of my life. At my birth, the medics failed to arrive on time, and it was necessary to seek the help of a neighbor pensioner who had been a midwife. Because it was raining and she lived far away, she didn't attend my birth, and my uncle had to help my mother in the actual delivery, cutting my umbilical cord with a kitchen knife. He did a good job, too, no worse, certainly, than they do in a maternity ward. When the medics finally came to take my mother to the hospital, I had already arrived in this earth, strong, last of 6 children, blue-eyed, normal weight and height. Later, a light head of light curly hair would appear. My father, Wolf Andreyevich ZHIRINOVSKY, was a humble lawyer who worked in the administration of the Turkestan-Siberian Railway. He died in an automobile accident the year I was born, and I didn't even realize that someone called Papa had existed. Mom was left without any support. We owned a cow that we were forced to sell because we could not feed her. Mama parked me at a 24-hour nursery, leaving me for all practical purposes on my own. As an infant, I spent 6 days a week in the ward with 20 other kids. When I was old enough, I was transferred to an ordinary kindergarten, and I remained there until I was 6. I didn't like going there, but at least I had some company. There was never anyone waiting for me at home. In the summer, I supported myself by scurrying around orchards, picking apples, pears, plums, and cherries. Under the bright sun, I and other children ran around barefoot, dressed in shorts and t-shirts. At home, there's no special place for me, no toys, no children's books, and I lived those in a cave. Later, when I was drawn to culture, I would thumb through the pages of an adult books Mama enjoyed reading, such as An American Tragedy by Theodore Dreiser, Queen Margot by Hugh Noel Williams, and Silmer Works. Although I didn't understand everything I read, I was an enthusiastic reader. I entered first grade in September 1953. On the first day, my teacher, Maria Petronova Simsiova, told us, "You're no longer boys, you're students." I took what she said to heart. My first grade class was all male, although girls would join us in the second grade. When I went home after the first day of school, I was greeted by an empty apartment. Mama was at work. I put down my new book bag and took off my suit. Mama had switched together the little outfit on a neighbor's sewing machine. It was the first I had ever owned. It had trousers and a little white single-breasted jacket with buttons, the kind that sailors or train conductors wear. Mama worked in a cafeteria. It was a job that meant more security and better nourishment. She ate her meals there and would bring home food to me, and from then on, I was a ward of the state and got all of the meals from the cafeteria. Food was awful, of course, and it ruined my digestive system, but what could a little boy do? At the time, I was always hungry. After school, I would go home to my mother at her work and wait for her to give me dinner. Employees got their meals free, but she was forced to steal food to help keep me nourished. She would humiliate herself, begging the cook for a bowl of soup or some stale cutlets, which I would eat before returning home. I was not always lucky, and there would be no food. My strongest memories of childhood are being hungry and never having enough to eat and picking at food that was on the table, monotonous and barely edible. My clothes were as drab as my food, except when Mama sewed something for me. I wore second-hand clothes that had belonged to someone who had either outgrown them or had died. In either case, the clothes were purchased at a thrift store and were always old or shop-worn. Once Mama sewed an oversized shirt for me with vents in the side from a remnant of a bright checkered cloth. I went with other boys to swim in a local pond. When I returned to the shore, I discovered that my splendid checkered shirt had been stolen. From the moment of my birth, I encountered numerous social problems, the late arrival from medics for my delivery, a childhood of hunger and cold winter temperatures that dropped as low as 20 below Celsius, worn shoes and boots that offered no warmth, and clothes that were patched and frayed. And from my first day in school, I experienced not one moment of happiness. There was no one to take me to school, no one to be with me after. From my birth, I felt a sense of regret, grief, and loneliness. I was never happy. No one said hello to me, no one hugged me, no one cared, pressed me. My mother never had any time or energy to show me affection because of her hard work. When she left in the morning, I was still sleeping, and when she returned at night, I had already fallen asleep. Sometimes I didn't see her for days. Even on Sundays, her only day off, Mama was busy doing laundry and house cleaning chores that had to be done in our communal apartment. She got Saturdays off only after I had left home. Once ours alone, the apartment had been obtained in 1940 by my mother's first husband, who then was a colonel in the military. He and my mother had 5 children crammed into a 3-room apartment. With the outbreak of the war and a shortage of living space, people moved in with our family. We lost one room and then a second, so that at the end of the war we were squeezed into a single room. In 1944, my mother's husband died of tuberculosis. In 1945, she married my father, who passed in 1946, leaving us in our one cramped room communal apartment. After a life filled with humiliation and hardship, apparently the lot of our entire nation, my mother died in May of 1985. Even today, it pains me to reflect on her pleasureless, harsh, scrimping existence. She, born in 1912, and my father, born in 1907, had suffered through Tsarism, the Revolution, the Civil War, and the Great Patriotic War. Like many Russians, she had endured re-settlements, indignities, bureaucratic red tape, passports, residence permit, entitlements, and prohibitions. Indeed, for most of the 20th century, our whole Russian nation has been in transit. We traveled in carts, rattling over country roads and potholes. We smashed the Germans and set a man in space, but the process destroyed family and our sense of histories. And yet, how good it had briefly been at the beginning of the century during the Russian Empire. Both my father and mother had been the Empire's subjects, but then the new borders were drawn and Ukraine and Poland would disappear. Pensakia province would become Mordanian Republic. Verny would be swallowed up by the Kazakh Autonomous Republic, a full-fledged Union Republic, and finally by an independent Kazakhstan. What did we do to deserve such misfortune? I do not know. What I remember keenly is that I left my first grade with memories of walking myself in my white suit up Dzerzhinsky Street to my home on Duganskaya. I spent 11 years studying in the same intermediate school with vocation instruction. As students, we were trained to become level 2 automobile mechanics. From 8th grade on, we worked twice a week at alma mater's auto repair factory. Number 2, for work study, we spent an entire day from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Our city and school had a multinational population. Amongst its members were Jews who apparently, because of migrations and settlements of World War II, had fled the Western territories, settling in Alma Ata, where they were represented among the intellectuals as teachers and school mentioned. We also had Germans living among us, along with Ungars, Dugans, Uzbeks, Greeks, and some Korean people. There were also a few Kazakhs. Kamimoya is the only one I remember, mainly because his father was Kazakhstan's Minister of Highway Transportation. Later revealed that he only had a 4th grade education and become minister only because he was a Kazakh. From childhood on, I was a victim of national oppression. I would ask my mom, why can't we get our own apartment? She would answer, we're not Kazakhs. We'll have trouble getting an apartment here. Kazakhs are first in line. They receive the preference. When my mother worked in the cafeteria of an institute, the instructors often told her how bad they felt for Russian students who, in entrance exams, would be given mark of 2, while Kazakh would earn a 4 for the same answer. Disappointed, Russian boys found themselves excluded from higher education, while Kazakhs with insufficient schooling were permitted to continue their studies. Isn't this discrimination national oppression? How could such treatment not affect my soul and my consciousness? The literate and semi-literate villagers who had come to the city carrying their possessions in cloth bags were admitted to institutes of higher learning. Drawn to the city like these people to a completely different culture would later import their relatives from far-flung villages. Discrimination against Russians was epidemic in business, culture, and the legal system. We mutilated our country. We turned it into a backward place, compelling the Russian nation, which at one time had occupied the vanguard, to retreat. We drove the population underground by economic and legal, psychological pressure, and today we're being told that we cannot manage without the help of foreigners and that we cannot rely on ourselves. This is a shame. When I was a child, I saw this injustice clearly, and internal protest lodged myself in school. So, at the end of 11th grade, and my class sat down for one last portrait. Today I have class photos for every year. We students drifted apart. Most of us classmates remained in Alma Ata, but 2 or 3 of us left for other cities. It was not easy leave-taking. By then, I had, of course, taken a liking to some of the girls in my class, and there were a few rendezvous, kisses, telephone calls, innocent, youthful experiences that would later fade to memory. First time I arrived in Moscow, I had attempted my new surroundings. Again, there were financial difficulties along with the dinginess of the communal life, dorms, bunk beds, 4 people to 1 array, communal bathrooms, dining halls, and cafeteria food. These shifting conditions, together with a rigorous course of study and institution, where there many new disciplines and high expectations, placed a great pressure on me, a youth of 17. When I should have been meeting girls and enjoying youthful romance, I was burrowing into stuffy textbooks. By the time I was 20, it was clear that something wasn't right. With no one interest me, I had missed out on the early lush of lyrical romance, leaving my soul impoverished. Perhaps my love for my mother was the cause of my resentment and loneliness. Growing up without a father, I centered all my childish capabilities around my mother. I couldn't imagine her dying or going off somewhere. I loved her dearly. I loved her doubly for a lack of father, triply because I saw her suffering and was willing to alleviate it. Sometimes I see her tears, I would ask, Mama, why are you crying? She answered, you'll understand when you grow up. And later, I did understand her life of deprivation and hardship. Conscious of social problems at an early age, I bought books on fundamental politics, economics, and philosophy, and eagerly read on the social sciences. I began thinking about the future profession. Influenced perhaps by the fact that 2 of my brothers were in the army, I initially felt a desire to become a military officer. Military units, cavalry, artillery, enlisted men frequently paraded past our apartment building, making a strong impression on me, along with many films made about the war. Later, I was drawn to the legal field and wanted to become an investigator. My interest was sparked by films, criminals, murderers, thieves, and detectives. And finally, my third option was to enter politics. An uncle had told me, Voldila, go to Moscow and enroll at Moscow State Institute for International Relations. Become a diplomat. That's a good life. And indeed, foreign affairs was so interested in me that I spent a lot of time studying maps of different countries. I loved geography lessons, and I fell to the pull of politics. With philosophy, economics, and foreign affairs, social problems, and the national question, making myself such an impersonal my personal life. I made a decision I would enter the Institute of International Relations in Moscow, or failing that, Moscow State's Institute for Oriental Languages. Having settled on my career objectives with Mama's blessing, on June 3rd, 1964, I landed at Moscow's Vunkhod Airport, or on the Illusion 18 jet, carrying me with a small suitcase and such ordinary items as a t-shirt and change of underwear. I didn't even possess a pair of shoes. However, I did carry a basket of strawberries and tomatoes that Mama wanted me to take as a gift to the admissions committee. She had no idea that I had presented the blanket of strawberries to the committee. I would have been guilty of bribery. I arrived in the center of Moscow on Manizim Square. The airport bus happened to stop at the Lenin Museum. At an important information office, I learned that the Institute of Oriental Languages was just across the street next to the Hotel Nacional. Presenting my documents to the institute, I received my first blow. Documents were not appropriate for enrollment. It turned out that one important document, a recommendation from the regional committee of Commissal, was missing. I had previously written my brother, who lived in Moscow and was in the military, to find out the admission relations. He told me that the institute provided no dormitory accommodations, which later proved to be untrue. In fact, there were 4 dormitories at the institute. But by deceptively claiming to have no dormitories, the institute could block admission to anyone from outside Moscow. I also discovered that I couldn't meet the entrance standards, which required a combined score of 19 points. There was no way I could get 5s for geography, composition, and English. For me, a graduate in ordinary school in the provinces, to get a 5 for English was simply impossible. Getting a 5 was difficult for even students from special schools in Moscow who had lived overseas with their parents. My ambition blocked, I had decided to attend the Institute for Oriental Language, but even there, a recommendation was required. Going to live with my brother in a Moscow suburb, I immediately wrote a letter to my mother asking her to quickly get me a recommendation. Poor Mama ran off to the school, although summer break began, managed to somehow get me a recommendation from the Commissar's local regional committee. I submitted the documents to the institute. I received a bunk of the institute's dormitory and began to prepare for exams. I realized that my knowledge of English was insufficient. Moreover, I was faced with 5 examinations in composition, spoken Russian, history, and English, as well as spoken. I went straight away to the institute and asked a woman to help me find a tutor in English. She gave me the phone number of an instructor who had tutored students for her very institute. The tutor lived in the neighborhood of Rekondol-Voskel, and I immediately began my studies with him. For 10 lessons and a huge amount of money to the tutor, I passed my exams with a 3 for competition, a 4 for Russian and literature, 5 for history, and a 3 for Russian English composition, and a 3 for oral English. It was enough to get me in. At the time, there was not much interested in institutions devoted to humanities. Everyone wanted to go to Moscow's MIFI technical schools and schools of humanities, the Bauman Institute. Since the humanities were not popular, the competition was not especially keen. There were merely 3 candidates for every place. Practically everyone who passed the last examination was therefore enrolled. I received my student ID and yet another blow. I was told that I had scored a 3 on some tests. I wouldn't qualify to receive a stipend. Throughout my 18 year, I constantly experienced such blows. Thank God I was denied dormitory accommodation. Still, I finally get a stipend of 33 rubles, and then when added to another 32 for Mama, allowed me to survive just barely for 5 years as a student. Because of my poverty, I was once again eating badly and dressing poorly. What could you buy for some 65 rubles from a miserly sum I had to pay for the dormitory, books, and daily meals. I couldn't afford to spend more than 2 rubles on anything, and I couldn't go to the cafe without ruining my budget. I couldn't enjoy a date or tickets to the movies, a concert, a disco, or a ball. My life was suffocated by poverty and filled with humiliation. With no money or frills for pleasure, I threw myself with vengeance into my studies. I was immersed in the humanities. The unpleasant subject of mathematics, physics, chemistry, and biology were behind me, replaced by the liberal arts. Yet there were still subjects I didn't like, such as the linguistic and philological disciplines. I enjoyed history, but I was studying at the Department of History and Philology, and by mistake, I had never been admitted to the philology program. Nevertheless, thanks to God, I wound up in the Department of Turkish Studies, rather say than Mongolian or Vietnamese. I could have been forced to study African languages like Bambara or Malinka. In Moscow, I was again surrounded by national minorities who were everywhere flaunting their money, wine, and women, yet for grades they generally got nothing below a 3. A national cadre arrived, the son of the chairman of Georgia's Council of Ministers, and he did nothing. I graduated with honors and was drafted into the army. The son of influential ministers got 3s and were sent to work abroad. What could I do? I went to Turkey and heard complaints. Who's in charge of your country? Why do you send us? Your Turkish is good, but there's everywhere in my studies, at work, and abroad, I came up against the disruption, national policy of discrimination. Russia is called an empire. We Russians reproach for seizing power and living at the expense of other nations for suppressing their national consciousness, their ethnic pride. We allowed cooks to rule the state first, then shepherds, so today we have fallen behind. I was a student with a wretched stipend and caught in the dormitory alone, without friends in an unfamiliar city. Of course, I expended a lot of energy in adapting and making early acquaintances and personal contacts, but mostly I devoted my energy to my studies. Became a good student. By the second year, I received a stipend of 47 rubles and 50 kopecks several semesters in a row. I was chosen as senior student and by junior and senior students as the Komsomol organizer. In 1967, I became politically active with a letter I sent to the Communist Party's Central Committee proposing reforms to be carried out in our education industry. I was sense that developed in our country was not proceeding properly and confirmed by observing everyday life around me. What's more, is I had to learn the important lessons on economics, philosophy, and the history of the Soviet Communist Party through interactions with both fellow students and teachers. April 15th, 1967, the exact date of my letter to the Central Committee, marks the beginning of my conscious, active political life. In December 1967, I took another step in this direction by making a truculent presentation in a debate titled Their Democracy, that is, Democracy in the West and Our Democracy. For some reason, someone who usually attended such debates didn't like my remarks. Added a critical note and was sent to the Institute's manager, A.A. Kovalev, and to the prorector, M.Y. Yuriev. My first political setback thus dates all the way back to 1968. For reasons called so-called political unreliability, I was denied reference to necessary to serve as an interpreter for an athletic trip to Turkey. By that time, dissidents had already made their appearance, and political trials were raging, with some people being banned and others sent into exile. My activities were hardly of that sort to incur such penalties were enough to make me unfair of the label unreliable. Angry at this injustice, with my year abroad, 5th year approaching, I was assigned to the State Committee on Radio, where I worked for an intern for 8 months in the Turkish section for the foreign broadcasting. Later, I moved to the internship at the State Committee for Foreign Trade Relations. I very much wanted to go to Turkey, since I had studied the country and language, but relationships between our countries had been weak. It appeared that none of us students had the chance to go there. And then I found out it was possible to go to Turkey through the Trade Commission after getting necessary approval and April 1969, I made my first visit to a capitalist country. My only trip abroad before the visit to Turkey had occurred in 1966 when I traveled to Hungary as a participant in a construction brigade from Moscow State University. We crossed the border at Siops and I found myself in a foreign land. I loved Budapest, and while there I fell in love with a Hungarian girl from Debrecen named Aniko, and after rendezvous, kisses, heavy petty sessions, and an exchange of letters for following 7 months, and then nothing. What a month and a half I spent in Budapest working on a construction site, taking excursions around the country, visiting Lake Balaton. Among other outings I made were visits to a student camp near Anapa on the Black Sea, in Pitsuana in a canyon, and at the House of Rest in Krasnodario, a suburb of Moscow. With students from Moscow University, I went on skiing trips, to dances, and on dates. Although I wanted to fall in love with someone, to court someone, nothing came of my efforts. I suppose it's my own fault. I was simply too preoccupied with social problems and spent too much time on studies at the expense of my personal life, so I lobbied the 8-month assignment in Turkey because I had given Soviet pins to local Turkish youths. A small scandal broke out on my visit. Was attempting to charge me with spreading communist propaganda. Bad luck again. There was always a setback. I graduated from Moscow State University with honors, but no one was at the graduation to share my happiness. I received my red diploma in the Assembly Hall on Lennon Hills. No family or friend accompanied me. No one celebrated me or shared my joy. I went back to my lonely dormitory with my diploma. No one was there to partake in a glass of congratulatory champagne. I was completely alone. After graduation, my enlistment order for the army arrived, dispatching me to Tbilisi, another unfamiliar city in an unfamiliar republic. First, Turkey, from which I had just returned, and where I had to all these unpleasant experiences, and now Georgia. Why not Russia? During the choleric summer of 1970 in Zaporizhzhia I had bought after graduation, I headed for Tbilisi. Okay, thank you.